As a freshly minted pet parent and a longtime lover of dogs and all their cute little wet noses, it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Alexandra Horowitz is a behavior scientist in dog cognition. She teaches psychology, animal behavior, and dog cognition at Barnard College in Columbia University. She's a New York Times bestselling author, and with her book Inside of a Dog, she has shown us why dogs are the way they are. Today, she's speaking about her new book, Being a Dog, and like the title suggests, we're going to follow dogs into their fascinating world of smell. Please welcome Alexandra Horowitz.
Thank you. Thank you. So I did think I would tell you a little bit about this book generally, and then back up and talk about some of the research within it and how I even got to the point of writing a book about essentially a nose. This book is about noses, all noses, but especially dogs' noses. This is my dog and my dog's beautiful nose. I hope you're admiring his nostrils. I mean, it's really a lovely shot by Katie Orlinsky from the New York Times. But also, in this book, I take a kind of deep dive into the world of olfaction. And so it makes sense to be focusing at and looking at his nose. I haven't always been interested in smelling. In fact, I've probably never been interested in smelling or noses, or thought much about them until recently. But I have always been a lover of dogs, and I've lived with dogs my whole life. And as a grad student, that morphed, surprisingly and quite accidentally, into being a researcher of dogs. I actually was studying non-human animal cognition, doing cognitive science down in San Diego, and looking for a population of animals to study natural behavior. And I was interested in the behavior of play behavior, because in developing humans, it's a really important time for emergent cognition, especially metacognition, thinking about the self, thinking about others, and playing with those boundaries. I can be me, but I can also be the role of my father. I can be the role of a nurse. This is a banana, but it's also a phone, and that's funny, pretend in reality. So I wondered if any other animal was playing in the same kind of way that humans play, and if so, we could make some inferences about their mind based on their behavior. So I'm in a cognitive science program. I'm looking around for the animal to study. People study primates, non-human primates, right? Because that's the most likely animal, we think, evolutionarily to be similar to us cognitively. They play, but then they go away and they hide from you and they don't play on demand. Meanwhile, I had a dog, Pumpernickel, mixed breed dog, shaggy, sheep-shaped dog, who I was taking out to the beaches and parks to play about 3 times a day. And so I was a grad student, and so obtuse in some ways. It took me about 6 months before I realized, oh, I should study dog play. And so that's what I wound up doing, as my dissertation was on social play between dogs. And then I just got more interested in dogs as qua-dogs instead of just the theoretical topic. The result was that when I went to Barnard, I started a dog cognition lab. We do simple behavioral experiments, asking dogs, which of these things do you prefer? What do you notice here? And I also do natural observations of dogs. That's dogs in their natural setting, which is here. It is with us. It is in the parks interacting with other dogs and with people. And then I wrote Inside of a Dog, which was all about what it's like to be a dog. The dog Umwelt, as the German biologist Jakob von Uexküll coined this word. It's actually a German word. If you know German, you know it means something like environment. He used it to mean what it is like, the self-world that each of us carries with us, the little soap bubble each of us carries with us, that defines how we see the world and interact with the world. We don't really even know each other's Umwelt, what it is like to be another person. But I can look at you and say, well, we have cognitive equipment similar, perceptual equipment is similar. I can ask you, what's it like to be you? And you can tell me, and I can assent to that. But what is it like? What's the Umwelt of another species? You have to really appreciate their cognition. You have to appreciate their perceptual ability. And that's how you get to this. That's how you get to doing a deep dive into noses. For dogs, as we already know, are olfactory creatures. when given the chance, they put their nose in that thing. And so the question for me was, and we all knew this at some level, but exactly what is the world experienced through olfaction? How do we know this? What can they do with their noses? Why are they so good smellers? And what might it be like to be that creature? So half of the book that I've written, Being a Dog, was about exploring the dog nose. And that has to do, at some level, with trying to explain the dog nose. And there is good reason that the dog is olfactory and we are not. So you compare the dog nose to our own schnoz, and you see some important anatomical and behavioral differences. The first one is that the dog has hundreds of millions more olfactory receptor cells than we do. So all noses have receptor cells, which are just the cells which the odorant molecules hook into and which may prompt the cell to fire and the brain to perceive the smell. These cells, by the way, are between our eyes back here. All this rest of the nose that we think of as the nose is not unimportant, but that's not where we're smelling. So we have a couple of million. Dogs have hundreds of millions. But that's just the first nose, what I consider the first nose of the dog, because there's also a second nose of the dog that we do not have. It's called a vomeronasal organ. And it's actually above the roof of the mouth, below the nose, and it detects odors, which we wouldn't even consider scents, but molecules which are not volatile, but instead have to be absorbed. And that includes things like hormones. So when people talk about dogs being able to perceive someone's fear, or that's perhaps the smell of cortisol. That's why they're so interested in each other's urine. If you get really close to it, and in fact, if you get to lick it, then you can potentially get the smell, get the odorant molecules absorbed through your nose, through the palate, and to the vomeronasal organ to be perceived. But that's not it. The dog's snout really matters. This is from research by Brent Craven and Gary Settles and their colleagues that shows the interior of the snout. I mean, it almost, if you've studied cognition, it almost looks like a brain stuck inside the nose. It's actually turbinate bones. But what it gives you a glimpse of is this really convoluted structure of bones in the nose that helps humidify and warm the air as it's sniffed and race it back to the epithelium. Just to compare with our nose, we have basically 1, 2, 3, where those 3 dots are 3 turbinate bones. So that compares with this extremely convoluted structure that the dogs have, which makes their smelling that much better. They also have 2 roots for inspiration or inhaling. If we breathe in through our nose, then all the air goes far back in the nose and into our lungs, right? A little bit of the air goes to the olfactory epithelium. Unless you really sniff, not very much of it goes back there. That's why we're not having extraordinary smell experiences all the time right now. Do you smelling anything now? Probably not. Have you smelled anything today? Maybe not. Maybe 1 or 2 things. Those would be things that are really intense smell or something you bring to your nose, basically. But the dog has a committed olfactory route. So some of the air goes to the olfactory epithelium, some goes to be breathed. So they are reliably smelling the world the way we aren't. But that's not it. They even sniff better than we do. So I didn't even think about whether you could do a sniff better or worse, but we can, and we don't do it better, basically. We have a simple sniff about, if you sniff, it's usually about 1.5 seconds per sniff. And then if we exhale out the same nostrils, right? It's a very simple mechanism. Dogs are different in a couple of ways. They can sniff about 5 to 10 times a second. You know that from watching your dog, and I hope you're looking carefully at dog nostrils, because you really should. So you can't do without hyperventilating, but that's getting a lot of odor pictures in the nose all the time. But then as this is sort of partially showing, the same researchers, fluid dynamic researchers, showed the airflow around the nostrils, they have a better method of exhaling. So, as I say, you exhale to get rid of a smell in your nose. If it's a horrible smell you're passing, you can kind of exhale it out. And it's actually displaced from the receptor cells, and the air leaves your nose. But dogs don't want to do that. They don't want to get rid of the odor picture in front of them with every exhale. So they exhale mostly out the side slits of their nose. So that means they can get this continuous inhale. I mean, some of the olfactory researchers I talked to likened it to a kind of circular breathing that a brass player might do or woodwind player might do. And also, if they're close enough to the ground, and you know dogs like to be close to the odor source, when they exhale, it actually creates a puff of air that hurries more odorant material into their nose. Because for something to be smelled, it has to be volatile, it has to be in the air. So one of the ways to do that is to blow puff air against the ground, which is what they're doing with their exhales. Another good way to do that is to have long, dangly ears, like your bloodhounds, like your bassets, which hit the ground while they're sniffing. That's probably not accidental design there. That actually helps to get more odors into their nose. That's how dogs are better than, their equipment is better than ours before you get to the brain. But two, and this is, you'll excuse my rendition, I hope. There's something called cortical magnification, which is a way of thinking, what would your body look like if it, instead of being scaled the way it is scaled to how it's represented in the brain. And so I'm just focusing on the one part. If you did a cortical magnification with the dog, you know, the nose is highly overrepresented. If you do a cortical magnification with us, it's our eyes, it's our hands. You know, it's the places you expect. It's not our elbows and it's not our knees. And this allows dogs to do these amazing detection tasks. So one of the things I did in this book was tracked the working dogs, followed what they were doing, saw how they were being trained. I came to Seattle and went a little bit north and watched the truffle detection dogs. I don't know if you know that you actually are, live very close to truffle forests, and there are dogs out there working the forests and finding truffles. And I followed detection dogs being trained. And when you see the result of what these dogs can do, you do start to get a really great picture of what it might be like to be an olfactory creature. For instance, here's what it's like to be a visual creature. We can look at these footsteps in the sand, and we have some idea where this person in the past, which way the person was going, right? But what if water has washed up over the prints? We no longer have that visual cue. Tracking dogs can tell, though. They can tell in 5 footsteps which way somebody has gone, research has shown, because there's actually a difference in concentration in the odor from the 1st to 5th footstep, which is about 2 seconds. So essentially, the 5th footstep is newer. It's more recent. So it's actually slightly stronger odor. And I'm talking about odor of the person going through their shoe than the first. So there is a way that smell tells, dogs are telling time through smelling. Smells tell time. A newer odor, a stronger odor is more recent. And a past odor, an older odor, is less strong. So they're seeing a little bit of the past in what's underfoot, odors that have fallen to the ground, and they might be smelling a little bit of your future person you haven't seen coming around the corner, because if the breeze is right, if the air currents are right, the dog can smell that person coming. They're almost there to the dog. Hunting dogs can do also amazing tracking, and what you'll see is here, this is an old National Geographic image, and this dog is wearing a collar which shows its path, trying to find this pheasant. Basically, it's detecting concentration, gradient of concentration, zigzags around what had been the path of the partridge dragged to this point. So when it gets weaker and weaker, that he returns around and returns to it's stronger and stronger, and then eventually finds the animal. As I said, I went to the Working Dog Center at Penn Vet, where they're training detection dogs, and they have constructed beautiful things like this. This is meant to imitate basically a destruction zone, a rubble pile, where if a building fell, say, and you needed to go and look for survivors or for cadavers, you would want the dog to be trained on similarly varied and difficult surfaces. So what happens there is they hide you in one of these pipes coming out of the ground. You close the lid over you. You hold a tug toy in your hand, and you feel like you're missing. You feel like you need to be rescued, essentially. They let the dog go, and this is not a dog who's trained on me. You know, they're just trained to find the person in this olfactory scene. And within a few seconds, you can feel the dog coming closer. And as they come close, when they do their alert, which in this case they were training them on about an 8-bark alert. Once they've done that, you come out and you give them the tug toy, and they're kind of shocked, but play with it. That's their reward. That's, in essence, the process of training the dogs. All dogs can do this kind of detection behavior. I mean, they have the nasal equipment for it, but only some dogs have the drive to do it. And that's really the thing you need in the dog. In other words, to spend the day frustrated looking for the smell of person, and then to be satisfied when you get that person with a game of tug or a game of ball. So there's a fellow at University of Washington, Sam Wasser, who works with scat detection dogs. He uses these dogs to train to locate populations of wild animals who we rarely see, but the dogs can find their scats. So that's a great marker of what the population is. He finds his dogs in shelters. They don't have to be purebred dogs. He looks for the real high energy dogs, the ones, I consider them kind of anti-pets, the ones that are hard to place, because they have a huge motivation, they don't want to stop, and they really want to play tug, or they really want to chase a ball. Those are dogs that it's pretty easy to turn onto finding scat, finding a person, finding an explosive, finding drugs. Also at the Penn Working Dog Center, they're training dogs in ovarian cancer detection, and this is a big line of detection research that's developing. Started in the 90s when some people noticed, some just owners with dogs noticed that their dogs were sniffing their leg a lot and being kind of a nuisance, and after a couple of months, again, we're obtuse, we don't recognize these things right away, go to the doctor and find out they have a melanoma, which the dog has detected. So now there is basically, this is research, proof of principle research, training dogs to detect cancer volatiles in exhaled breath, in blood, in urine, and they're quite good at it. We don't see dogs in hospitals yet, just sniffing you, and you shouldn't go home, lie down, and say like, all right, find the sickness, but odor does have a smell, disease does have a smell to dogs, and so they can notice it. They just have to care. In our dog cognition lab, and as I say, we do very simple behavioral experiments, I'm trying to test what it might be like to be a pet dog. There's a detection dogs who are really trained on certain odors. So here's just an example of one of the studies we do, and that we published, where we know that dogs, if you give them 2 plates, one with 1 piece of hot dog and one with 3, have no problem making that choice. It's not a difficult choice. But what if you close the container? Since dogs are such good smellers, we assumed that they'd be able to notice the smell of 3 is more intense than 1. So we simply did that, presented them with both 1 and 3 hot dogs under a container, and then put them down and let them choose. What we found is that they chose randomly. So these are pet dogs, definitely not trained dogs. They weren't making discrimination based on smell. But here's what we also chose. Sometimes we had them investigate both plates, and then we had their owners go up and choose the smaller plate and smell it and say, oh, this is really yummy, and put it down. And then we had the dogs make a choice. And what we found is that they reliably chose the plate that the owner had focused on, even though it smells less hot doggy. So I think what has happened with pet dogs is that we have put our feelings about smelling onto the dogs, and we're not giving them olfactory world, which allows them to take advantage of their noses. In fact, we're making them be in the visual world that we think is so valuable and important. So they follow us, they follow where we're looking, they follow where we're pointing, but they're not using their noses. I started to try to remedy this, and I talk about this in my book too, with nose work classes. And these are classes where you basically train pet dogs in a similar way that a detection dog would be trained. You start with neutral scents, you make them very obvious, and then you hide them at increasing levels of difficulty, and you ask them to find them. We get a reward at the end. That's all it is. So here's my dog going around a room with overturned buckets and suitcases and so forth. Yeah, she's a cutie, yeah. And then here he is finding something on the windowsill. My dog was 8 when I started doing the nose work game classes with him. This is Finnegan, and he, and now you can't, ever leave dog treats on the windowsill because they will be discovered, But I also now am able to. I ask him occasionally to find something that I've lost. If we're walking on a path together and I drop my keys, which smell somewhat of me, Finnegan can find them. He's not trained on keys. He's not a key detection dog, right? But he now knows to search. And I think it's changed and enriched his life. The other half of the book, which I'll just mention for a second, was me trying to be a better smeller. Me trying to imagine my way into what it's like to be a dog by increasing my awareness of smells. So the first thing I did was followed my dogs and tried to smell what they were smelling. Socially awkward to do that. And I wasn't really up to it yet. So I followed along with a woman named Kate McLean, who does smell walks. She's a designer, but she goes around in cities and gets conspirators to go and smell city blocks with her and take notes of what the smells are. So that also starts awkwardly, but with a group of people. Suddenly everybody is, going up against trees and sticking their nose in trash cans. And when somebody walks by, we're all air scenting after them. And suddenly kind of crafting what a block looks like through smells. I also did things like I followed animal trackers in Western Massachusetts who track animals not just by visual signs. Here you see a lot of visual signs of tracks of people, but right in the middle, this was a track that looked like it was a track of, it was an eagle that had taken off. And in fact, here's one of the naturalists, Charlie Eisman, sniffing the meal that the eagle had left behind. So using olfaction as the way to detect the animal that's been here. And in fact, I was, through my brief training, able to detect a porcupine through his pee, because porcupine pee smells piney. They eat pine, they eat hemlock, and so that's what they smell like, and you can smell them. So that was an amazing experience. I also followed perfumers, and I studied with sommeliers, spent a lot of time putting bottles of things to my nose so that I become more accustomed to sniffing things and naming them or making associations. So I think I'm going to stop there and have time for questions. But I want to say there are a couple of takeaways from my experience. One has to do with us and one has to do with dogs. To the latter, I would say if you have a dog, let your dog sniff. This is their world. When we open our eyes, we see a scene in front of us, but when they come awake out of sleep, they smell the world. And to yank them away from smells or from each other is to impose our feelings about smells on the dog and to not acknowledge that that's their way of perception. It'd be like driving by the Grand Canyon, looking out the window, and then somebody yanks you away. Like, don't look at that. The second is to then indulge it by taking some smell walks with your dog. We have walks now where the walk is not, I had realized what I was doing walks about what I thought was needed on a walk with my dog, which is you take your dog out to relieve themselves, to exercise, maybe to see other dogs. Those are good things, but also to smell. They want to see the world. Your house is not a wonderful smell environment because you might want things clean smelling. You might want things lavender smelling or coconut smelling, not the smell of you, not the smell of your dog, which are the smells which are relevant and rich for the dog. So we go out and the dogs lead the way and smell whatever they want. And sometimes they're not very long walks, but they're really enjoyable. I encourage that. And then I also think following the dog's lead. And smelling the world, bringing things to your nose, bring your nose to things, sniffing like you mean it, and then trying to think about what the smell is really can change your perception. I mean, there's an element here we can learn from the dogs that there's something we're missing, and we have the equipment for it, even if it's not as great as theirs. We should open it up. Thank you.
Is it true that dogs can find their way home with their sense of smell from hundreds of miles away? I want it to be true.
Right. The answer is yes. No, I mean, it's conceivable. There's certainly, it's one of the explanations for why we have olfaction, why and why some olfactory creatures can do what they do, is that it's for navigation. In other words, if you can detect olfactory landmarks along a route, then you can navigate using those landmarks. Hundreds of miles away is potentially problematic because smells probably won't be continuous as they go for hundreds of miles. But certainly, a dog can find their way by olfaction, and that could be part of what's happening in those stories. We don't hear, unfortunately, about the stories where dogs try to get home from hundreds of miles away and never make their way home. That never makes the news. So we don't know how common that is. I actually had a dog who once, when I returned home when I lived in San Diego, I got home and the door was open. She had somehow gotten the door open and left the house and was gone. And I thought, oh, well, that's that. I'm never going to see my dog. She wasn't a wanderer, but she was not home. It was the middle of the night. I didn't know what to do. I start walking the walks we would take. I don't see her. I call some of my friends to come over and hang out at the house while I go look for her. And these were friends who owned a dog food store in town, about a mile and a half away, and they pull up in about 20 minutes with their pickup truck, and this was my dog Pumpernickel. Pump is in the back. She jumps out of the truck, and I said, "Well, what?" And they said, "Well, we drove by the store on the way here, and she was sitting in front of the store." So she had left the house and navigated on her own. I don't know what route she took, but presumably by smell, the landmarks, not the smell of the store, to the store, and then she didn't have a plan B. Right, I'll just stay there now.
So I've noticed after bathing my Shiba, which is more like a cat than a dog, but he really rubs his head on the carpet. Is he trying to get off the smell of the shampoo? Or what's going on there? Is that like a track?
The short answer to that is
he marking
yes.
his trail or
No,
something?
It's getting rid of the smell. So again, we want dogs to smell like shampoo, but dogs don't, apparently, their behavior indicates they don't like to smell like shampoo because they count on their smell to be their signature, right? That is, and you know this already kind of implicitly, when dogs meet each other, they want to smell each other really up close or even at a distance. They're getting this, that's a signature scent. They're getting information about each other through their smell. So this smell seems to, for the moment, kind of obliterate it, as is just the reason you're washing the dog. And so, the first thing often they'll do is try to get rid of some of that scent, get back to their normal smell.
Do they have non-scented shampoo?
Oh, there should be, but because the purchaser is us, I don't think there's been a big market for that. But maybe that's a new line I should go into. The dog smelling shampoo. We'll see how that goes.
Just as a follow-up to that one, is there a preferred a preferred smell that a dog might want to have? For example, I have a Chihuahua, and I noticed that there are things in my backyard and around where he'll sort of get into something and kind of scratch at it for a bit and then vigorously roll in it, and there's nothing there as far as I can tell. As much as I want there to be something there, there's nothing. But then later on, I'm smelling it and I'm like, that is seriously rank. But I noticed that he does this constantly, and it's not like I bathe the thing all the time, he gets a couple baths a year and that's sort of it.
Well, what does the dog want to smell like? Apparently, given their behavior, they want to smell like that thing, that invisible thing in the grass that you think there's nothing there, but there is something there. It's something dead, and it's decaying, and it's and apparently because dogs prefer these smells, and we're not exactly sure why. There are a couple of theories about why they then roll in it. One is, to begin, that olfaction is really pretty quickly related to the motor, goes up to the motor cortex pretty quickly. So one theory of olfaction is that it's about action, right? So you notice something, if it's a toxic smell, you get away from there, or you don't put the thing in your mouth. It smells good, you might eat the thing. For dogs, there seems to be this strong link between, that smells good and I want it all over my body. So the theories are two, basically. One is camouflage, which maybe makes more sense for their other canids than for dogs, where maybe you want to smell like the environment a little bit, as opposed to having a distinctive smell that other conspecifics, other members of the species might be able to notice. So if you're a wolf who's going into someone else's territory, you don't want to smell like a strange wolf. You want to smell like the environment of that territory. Not maybe so relevant for dogs. The other theory is basically a kind of popularity theory, that if this is a really good smell, you want to have it all over you so that you are that smell, essentially. And then other dogs will come to you. Yeah.
So you mentioned the breeze, and you mentioned kind of trying to, smell like a dog.
Yes.
Did you become more aware of like the direction the wind was blowing?
Yeah. Oh, sure. You notice the smell, on a windy day or something, you might notice that your dogs go out and are really excited or really stimulated because there are a lot of odors coming on the breeze. And we're not great air scenters, but now I do appreciate a strong breeze because it's bringing odors from somewhere else. I can't always tell what they are. For us, it's much easier to bring things to our nose and sniff. We're not as good as air scenting, but I notice my dogs appreciating the breeze for sure.
So on the rotting smell thing, when I was a young boy growing up on a farm, I noticed our dogs used to take bones and stuff that had meat on it, and they would bury it, and then 3 or 4 weeks later they'd dig it up and it was rotted, and that's what I don't know if that's
sous vide kind of like right. Yeah, I'm not sure if that made it better or if they were saving it for later, and it just so happened that it also ripens over time. Yeah, but the nice thing about that too is that how do they remember where it is? It's probably olfaction that they remember where they've.
How much of it is driven by their
things.
nose versus wanting to? I mean, they obviously modern dogs are dogs that we have as pets.
Yeah.
They like to please us. I mean, my dog, at least my golden retriever and lab, they watch me to see exactly what my emotions are, what I'm thinking about. I'm assuming that's because that's how we grab domesticated dogs. We would pick the ones that.
Well, it's sort of a combination, right? I mean, dogs were definitely made or the proto-dog, the kind of wolf that maybe became a dog, a little different than the current wolves we see today, probably was susceptible in some ways to being around us, was interested in us, or at least was not interested in harming us, and that's why these other humans let them affiliate with them. And then why do we have these highly attentive, interested dogs? Because we chose to breed the ones which were more attentive to us, right? That is appealing to us. One of the things dogs do that not other non-human animals do is look us in the eyes, right? Well, that's really intimate and affiliate, and if you had a conversation with someone who wasn't looking you in the eyes, you'd think they're kind of shifty. And dogs look you in the eyes. So at some point we would have chosen to breed those dogs who did more of that familiar-like behavior, and now we have these dogs staring at us. It's our fault.
I was wondering how a dog's sense of smell compares to other animals. Like, are there other animals that have a stronger sense of smell than dogs, or?
Right, well, there certainly are plenty of other really good olfactory creatures. So elephants are great, rats are great. Any animal who has their nose close to the ground is probably an olfactory creature and maybe as good as dogs in some ways. The difference with dogs, the real distinction is between them and us. And the difference with them is from these other animals is that they're tractable. I mean, they care about interacting with us and they respond to us. So there are people training, I think, rats to do landmine detection, which dogs are employed to do. Because they have great olfaction, and people, I guess, are less concerned if they find a mine and it blows up. It's a tragedy to lose a dog every time that happens, when we're not as concerned about rats. But they also are different in training, right? They're not as easy to train in terms of responsiveness to the person, to the handler. So that's the real difference in terms of why dogs are out there in the airports, and dogs are living with people as diabetic alert dogs and not other animals.
With my childhood dog, I had a lot of fun playing the hide a treat then find a game. I tried it again years later with a friend's dog and had a hard time getting them to get the game, if you will. And I wondered if you had any tips for people to help teach and enjoy that game with their dogs.
Yeah, I mean, it's great that you did that game because, as I say, if it seems as though since we discourage our dogs from smelling, they don't instantly, they learn that, and they don't instantly go on to sniffing it. When we did the nose work classes, these are just pet dogs, and many were middle-aged dogs, and a lot of dogs, the very obedient dogs, had a lot of trouble starting the class. In other words, they have to learn that it's not the person pointing out where the thing of interest is, that they have to find it. And that also they're allowed to jump up and get it. So if you have a dog that you've trained not to jump on the counters, well, there's a little bit of a problem because sometimes the smell sometimes is on the counter or it's in a high place. Or if you have a dog you've trained to heel and never walk in front of you, well, that's a problem. Those dogs would stand with their person at the beginning of the class and just stand there and no one does anything because the dog doesn't know to take the lead. But every dog, after a few months, could unlearn, at least in this context, that all that obedience and come back into being a smelling creature again. So it's a hard process to unlearn being polite, but that's the first thing I would recommend, at least in the context of being at home and playing nose games.
Yes, I think this goes along with that. But I have a 1.5-year-old Labradoodle, and whenever we go for walks, she constantly wants to smell things, and sometimes it drives me a little bit crazy because we can't go more than a few steps without wanting to smell things. I guess I'm just curious about what would be sort of the general advice for dogs like that. I mean, is that something where you should try to teach them a heel, or sort of have a mix of smell walks and regular walks?
Yeah, think of that one as just going for smell. Like, let's go out for smell. If we don't have the idea that we need to make good time or make a certain amount of distance, it can be, I think, a pretty fulfilling experience for the dog. Maybe make it 1 in 3 of the walks that you have in the day is dedicated to that, as opposed to getting somewhere or meeting someone or getting back quickly. And if, it's hard to relax into that because we want something else to happen. We want something visual to happen. We want something motor to happen. We want to get someplace. When we all like indulging our dogs. So I feel like when you realize that that's a way to indulge your dog, it becomes a lot more satisfying.
So you mentioned that some pets have learned to prefer what the owner prefers. So do you have any advice on how to make dog food seem more exciting?
Dog food's such an interesting phenomenon because, that's for the owner. That was developed for the owner. In other words, there was a point in time, not so long ago, probably 100 some years ago, when there wasn't dog food. There was just food, and then the dog got the scraps, right? Which the dog could still, by the way, eat. I mean, you might want to be a little careful about nutrition, but dogs probably evolved eating our food. So dog companies are very interested in palatability, and they do behavior tests, and they're doing their research about trying to make it more desirable. But I have to say, the most interesting thing is not getting a bowl of kibble. It's simply not for a dog. I mean, it doesn't smell great, and often dogs are using smell to decide whether something goes in their mouth. It doesn't matter maybe what it tastes like in the mouth. As you know, dogs don't spend a lot of time considering the food when it's in their mouth. It's what does it smell like? So a lot of people have started doing this with their cats, and you could do it with dogs, is make it a search game. So get a big bowl, one of these toys, or create a toy, like use a gallon jug of something, make a hole, put the kibble in there, so they have to knock it around to get the food. So make it a little bit of a search game. Or give them things with different levels of odor mixed in with their food, so that there's olfactory excitement leading up to eating. That's what I would recommend. But the bowl of food in front of them at a predictable time every day, while convenient for us, is really unstimulating.
Any recommendations for humans to up their olfactory game?
Yeah, you really have to stick your nose in things. And so, and it's actually totally doable. I mean, every expert I met, expert perfumers, sommeliers, the animal trackers, these are not people who are born noses. These are people who've just spent a lot of time saying what is that? Actually the smell of metal is not, there's no metal smell. That's the smell of, researchers have shown that's the smell of your own sweat, basically, the sweat interacting with the metal. So that's my smell. That's what we recognize as a metal smell. But put things in your nose and sniff them regularly through the day. If you have something in your hands, put it to your nose. Start to take a good sniff, because otherwise it's not going to get up there to be smelled. And start trying to name things or make associations. What does it remind you of? When I did an olfactory study as part of my just trying to become more aware of smells at Rockefeller University, where there were 1,000 little tiny bottles over 10 different episodes. I had 100 each. And I had to just smell and rate the odors in all these bottles. This was basic olfactory research. So these were sort of random molecules that don't have odor names. And it was kind of horrifying, because you didn't know what the smell was going to be, and some were really vomitous smells. You had to really smell it and try not to retch. But I developed a method, and you would develop your own for trying to figure out what it was, which was to picture it. All right, what scene would have this smell in it? And then you kind of go down the hallways, corridors of the picture in your mind until you find the thing. And once you've done that, you've created a smell memory for yourself. And as we know, smell memories are not only really pleasant most of our smell memories are kind of exciting, and they're pleasing memories, as opposed to having the valence of whatever the odor was. It opens up this whole other memory. But once you have the memory there, then you can learn it. You're building a vocabulary, so the next time you smell, it's a little more automatic, or maybe a little more likely you're going to remember it. Right now, most of our smelling experience is involuntary, and it's forgotten. Right? So you smell something, you're not thinking about it, and so it's forgotten. So make it conscious, deliberate and conscious, and then you'll become a better smeller quickly.
So you're actually just creating, you're just closing your eyes at the time and just thinking purely creativity.
Yes, right. It doesn't have to be the right name for the smell. It just has to be developing associations. That process is the ruminative process that leads to a memory being formed, and it will include the smell in it. And then you can appeal to that again next time you smell that smell.
That's very much for you, but I'm wondering if it changes if it's like you're talking to another person.
Yeah, well, it's a separate question whether you'll then be able to share that with somebody else, where you're like, yeah, that's red. Did you smell that red smell? And then they'd be like, that's not red to me. That's not a red smell to me. That's possible, right? But it's pretty rewarding to see that we have this tool that we haven't been using, and that you can begin to use it. That's the thing you can share with the other smellers.
Other than a traumatic injury to a dog's nose, is there anything you should worry about?
In terms of their losing their smelling?
Right.
Not really. There are very few smells that seem to, insult them, particularly, or are too intense for them.
There's no smell that they would.
There's smells they don't prefer, that they'll move away from, right? Like their own excreta. Unless they're sick, they don't usually prefer that. They notice that it's theirs and they move away. In terms of thinking about dogs as a species going forward, we might want to continue to breed dogs that have good noses. So for instance, the short-nosed dogs are really impaired in respiration. The way we've bred them, that often they can't breathe well, and they're not able to use their nose to their full extent. In just looking at pet dog detection tasks, like just your average long-nosed or short-nosed dog, the long nose does a lot better at detection tasks. This is why you don't see the pugs explosive detection dogs, right?
Well, like my lab is very old, and she got cataracts, so she can't see very well.
Right.
So I presume
It looks like aging affects olfaction, but probably not as much. So the olfactory cells are really interesting in that they regenerate in us and all olfactory creatures every about 30 days. So unlike in our eyes, or in the ears, for instance, where the hair cells get mown down over time, but right now, if you're over 20, you're not hearing the high frequency sounds that you heard that kids today can hear, because you've just lost the cells. They've been damaged irreparably by vibrations. It doesn't happen with the nose because the cells regenerate. So that continues to happen as they age. So in some ways they might suffer less loss in olfaction than in vision or hearing.
Thank you. I have two quick ones, if that's okay.
Sure.
The first question was the story you told about losing your keys in the forest so that your dog could find them. And obviously, like you said, he wasn't trained on keys and he doesn't speak English. So how did you trigger him, I guess, to find those?
Right. So this is just after doing nose work where my dog learned, go find it. And he knows, okay, there's some scent to find. In nose work, you train them on neutral scents. Well, first you train them on a smell of a treat, which is hard for them to find, but then they have no problem finding cheese. If you're hidden cheese somewhere, they'll find it. But then it's things like anise and birch, which have kind of neutral smells. In other words, they're not palatable to the dogs. So he knows that means do a search, but you're not giving them a smell and saying, go find this smell, right? Like the search and rescue, that dog didn't need to be trained on my smell. They're just like, go find the person smelling thing in this field, or go find the new smell in this field. And so in this case, it's go find the thing that looks like it is to be found, basically. And you wouldn't start by dropping your keys in the forest and going out of the forest, but you start small, just right behind you. It's a little further away before you ask where it is. Then it might be hidden under something and so forth. You increase the complexity as you go, and then they can find it.
Cool. My other question was when you were talking about taking your dog on a walk and pulling them away from smells. Now it feels kind of mean once you put it that way. I'm wondering to what extent is that like blindfolding a person? I mean, Are you taking away their entire sense? How much do they rely on their sight versus their
It's
smell?
absolutely, I think, like blindfolding a person. I mean, given that vision is our primary sense and olfaction is theirs, it feels like an analog. They still have other things they can do. They can see. Their vision is pretty good. They have two-color vision. They can see motion better than we can. They can see better in low light conditions, but they're nearsighted, and they use it to assist olfaction. So if you take them away from the smell, they can still look. They can still hear. If you blindfold a person, we can still hear, we can still feel. So, it's not, I feel guilty when if I have to pull my dogs away from scent. And I don't want to just imbue everybody with guilt, but just to know that we don't have to do that they're just getting information about somebody who's come by before, and that's the type of information kind of we think is okay. So that's just their way of getting it in.
Do you think the dog thinks about what we're seeing in the world? Like, does a dog say,
why don't you find a person?
Yeah, what is a dog thinking, well, why don't you find a smell interesting? Why aren't you over here rolling around in it?
From the way my dogs looked at me when I smelled what they did, I think that was very confusing to them. I can't imagine. There's a big question about, like, what do dogs think in cognitive science and in comparative psychology? Do they sort of know their dog? Do they think about the differences that people can't appreciate the things that they're doing? I sort of doubt it at some level, but they have really flexibly changed themselves to be interested in what we're interested in. So I sometimes consider dogs anthropologists in our homes, because if we don't give them much to do, what do? They sit there and sort of watch us. Like, okay, and then they start to learn things like, oh, when she turns her head that way, like that leads to the refrigerator. And we know they learn these things because they start then knowing, like, oh yeah, how did she know I was going to go to the refrigerator? Because I always turn my head toward it before I go to the fridge. So they start to get up and go to the fridge too before I think I told them that I'm going there. So at some level, they're learning about our world more than we have been looking at them and studying them and figuring out what's important to them. I think we owe them that much.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. And dog.